For 28 years, my father thought I was a disappointment who wasted my life playing soldier in some desk job overseas. He believed I was too weak, too emotional, too female to ever amount to anything significant in the military. So when I came home for my wedding, wearing civilian clothes and talking about my little administrative position, he saw confirmation of everything he'd always thought about me. That's why he felt justified arresting me at my own wedding reception when he received what he thought was credible intelligence about a security threat. But when his own lieutenant walked into that interrogation room, snapped to attention, and addressed me as Colonel, my father's entire world and our family's understanding of who I really was shattered completely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of my childhood bedroom in Millfield, Ohio, casting delicate shadows across the wedding dress that hung on my closet door. In 3 hours, I would become Mrs. Sarah Chen-Martinez, marrying the love of my life in the same small church where my parents had wed 32 years ago. But as I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the dress that represented everything my family expected me to finally become, a proper wife, a conventional woman, someone who would settle down and live the life they understood, I felt the familiar weight of secrets I'd been carrying for over a decade. My father, Chief of Police Michael Thompson, had always been a man who saw the world in absolutes, right and wrong, strong and weak, success and failure, military and civilian, male and female. In his universe, there were categories for everything, and everyone had their place. For 28 years, I had been firmly placed in the category of disappointment. Sarah Elizabeth Thompson, he'd said to me countless times throughout my childhood, using my full name the way he did when he was about to deliver a lecture, the military is no place for a woman with your sensitivities. He'd pause on that word, letting it hang in the air like an indictment. My sensitivities. My tendency to cry when I watched movies about animals. My preference for books over sports. My habit of asking too many questions about why things had to be done in a certain way. When I announced at 18 that I was enlisting in the Army, the family dinner table had erupted in what could only be described as a controlled explosion. My mother, Patricia Thompson, had immediately launched into concerns about safety, marriage prospects, and the kind of life I was throwing away. My older brother, Detective James Thompson, had laughed outright, asking if I planned to file paperwork for the real soldiers. And my father had simply shaken his head with the disappointed expression I'd seen 1,000 times before. "You'll wash out in basic training," he'd said, with the certainty of someone delivering a weather report. "The military chews up and spits out people who aren't cut out for the real work. You'll be back here in 6 months, ready to do something more appropriate." But I hadn't washed out. I thrived in ways that surprised even me. The structure, the challenge, the sense of purpose, everything about military life seemed to unlock something inside me that had been dormant during my chaotic childhood in a family of law enforcement officers who saw strength only in terms of physical dominance and emotional control. The problem was I couldn't tell them about my success, not because I didn't want to, but because of the nature of my work. What had started as a standard military intelligence position had evolved into something far more complex and classified than anything my family could have imagined. For the past 5 years, I had been living a double life that would have made a spy novel seem mundane. To my family, I was Sarah Thompson, the disappointing daughter who enlisted and somehow managed to avoid getting kicked out, but who clearly wasn't doing anything important since I never talked about my work in any detail. When they asked about my job, I'd give vague responses about administrative duties and paperwork processing. When they wanted to know why I couldn't tell them more, I'd cite standard military protocol and change the subject. They assumed my evasiveness was because there wasn't much to talk about. In their minds, I was probably filing reports in some back office at a small base, doing the kind of mundane work that the military gave to people who couldn't handle real responsibility. My father in particular seemed convinced that my desk job was evidence of exactly what he'd predicted, that I'd found my level somewhere between failure and mediocrity. The truth was so far from their assumptions that it might as well have existed in a parallel universe. For the past 5 years, I had been Colonel Sarah Thompson, commanding officer of a joint intelligence unit that coordinated counterterrorism operations across 3 continents. My little administrative position involved briefing generals, coordinating with foreign governments, and making decisions that sometimes affected international relations. The paperwork I processed included classified intelligence reports that could determine the success or failure of operations involving hundreds of personnel. But my family couldn't know any of that. The security clearance required for my position meant that my real rank, my actual duties, and the scope of my responsibilities were all classified information. Even my closest family members were only cleared to know that I worked somewhere in military intelligence, doing administrative support. Everything else, the promotions, the commendations, the high-level meetings, the life and death decisions, had to remain secret.
So I'd spent a decade watching my father's disappointment deepen every time I came home for holidays or family events. I'd endured countless conversations about when I was going to get serious about my future, when I was going to stop playing soldier and find a real career. I'd listened to my brother's jokes about my make-work job, and my mother's gentle suggestions that maybe it was time to think about settling down and starting a family. The irony was devastating. My father, who had spent his entire career in law enforcement fighting to keep his community safe, couldn't see that his daughter was doing the same thing on a scale he'd never imagined. My brother, who took pride in his detective work and the cases he solved, had no idea that his sister's work sometimes prevented the kinds of crimes he investigated from happening in the first place. My mother, who worried constantly about my safety and my future, didn't know that I had a security detail and a pension that would make their middle-class lifestyle look modest by comparison. The engagement to David Martinez had been both a blessing and a complication. David was a civilian contractor who worked with various government agencies, which meant he had security clearance and understood the demands of classified work. He knew exactly who I was and what I did, and he loved me for it, rather than despite it. But to my family, David was just another sign that I was finally settling down and preparing to leave the military for a normal life. "Thank God you're finally coming to your senses," my father had said when I'd announced the engagement 6 months ago. "David seems like a solid man who can help you transition to civilian life. It's time to put this military phase behind you and focus on building a real future." I'd smiled and nodded, letting him believe what he wanted to believe, because the alternative was a conversation I wasn't authorized to have. I couldn't tell him that David and I had met during a joint operation in Eastern Europe, where I'd been the ranking officer and he'd been providing technical support. I couldn't explain that our relationship had developed over encrypted communications and classified briefings. I couldn't share that our wedding was being attended by generals and intelligence officers from multiple countries, all of whom would be traveling under diplomatic cover. Instead, I let my family plan a simple, traditional wedding in Millfield's oldest church with a reception at the community center where my father's police department had held their annual banquet for the past 15 years. They saw it as Sarah Thompson finally embracing the conventional life they'd always wanted for her. I saw it as the last time I'd have to pretend to be someone I wasn't. The plan had been perfect in its simplicity. After the wedding, David and I would return to our classified assignments, and gradually, over the course of several years, I would begin to share more details about my actual career with my family. As my security clearance levels changed and certain aspects of my work became declassified, I could slowly reveal the truth about what I'd been doing with my life. By the time I retired from the military, they would understand that their disappointment had been based on incomplete information. But as I sat in my childhood bedroom, adjusting the simple gold necklace that was the only jewelry I was allowed to wear due to security protocols they knew nothing about, I realized that my careful plan was about to be tested in ways I'd never anticipated. My phone buzzed with a text message from David. Security briefing moved up to 0800. Situation developing overseas. May need to adjust timeline. I stared at the message, understanding immediately what it meant. Somewhere in the world, events were unfolding that might require my attention, even on my wedding day. The life I'd built in the shadows of classified operations didn't pause for personal milestones, and the responsibilities I carried as Colonel Thompson couldn't be set aside just because Sarah Thompson was getting married. But my family, gathered downstairs preparing for what they thought was a simple small-town wedding, had no idea the complexity of the situation. To them, this was their daughter's special day, a celebration of her finally choosing a conventional path. They had no idea that the bride they were celebrating was someone they'd never actually met, and the simple ceremony they had planned was about to collide with a world of classified operations and national security concerns. As I heard my mother's voice calling up the stairs asking if I needed help with my dress, I made a decision that would change everything. For one day, I would try to be just Sarah Thompson, the disappointing daughter who was finally doing something that made her family proud. For one day, I would push aside the classified briefings and international crises and focus on the simple pleasure of marrying the man I loved in front of the people who had shaped my life. I had no way of knowing that within hours, my two worlds would collide in the most dramatic and irreversible way possible. I had no idea that my father's law enforcement instincts, combined with his complete ignorance of my real life, would create a situation that would force every secret into the light at the worst possible moment. As I stood up and reached for my wedding dress, I thought I was preparing for the happiest day of my life. Instead, I was preparing for the day that would either destroy my family or finally allow us to understand each other for the first time in 28 years.
The morning sunlight continued to stream through the lace curtains, illuminating the simple white dress that represented everything my family wanted me to be. In a few hours, I would discover whether love and truth could coexist, or whether some secrets were too big to survive the light of day. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The old stone church of St. Matthew's had never looked more beautiful. White roses and baby's breath adorned every pew, and the afternoon sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the worn wooden floors where 3 generations of Millfield families had celebrated their most important moments. As I walked down the aisle on my father's arm, I could see David waiting at the altar, his smile radiant with the kind of joy that made everything else fade into background noise. For exactly 43 minutes, I was just Sarah Thompson getting married to the love of her life. Chief Thompson walked with the measured pace of a man accustomed to ceremony, his dress uniform immaculate, his expression carrying the complex mixture of pride and melancholy that fathers wear when giving away their daughters. Despite all our disagreements, despite his constant disappointment in my choices, this moment felt pure. He was proud to be walking me down the aisle, proud that I was finally doing something he could understand and celebrate. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," he whispered as we reached the altar, his voice thick with emotion. For a brief moment, I saw past the stern police chief to the father who had taught me to ride a bicycle and checked for monsters under my bed. "I'm proud of you for choosing happiness." The ceremony itself was everything my mother had dreamed it would be. Pastor Williams, who had baptized me 28 years earlier, spoke about love, commitment, and the courage it takes to build a life with another person. David's vows were perfect, heartfelt without being too personal, romantic without revealing the classified circumstances under which we'd actually met. When he promised to stand by me through whatever challenges our unique circumstances might bring, only the two of us understood the weight of those words. My own vows had been carefully crafted to be both honest and safe. I promised to love David with the same dedication I brought to everything important in my life, to honor the trust he'd placed in me, and to build a future worthy of the sacrifices we'd both made to be together. The words carried layers of meaning that my family couldn't fully grasp, but they felt the sincerity behind them. When Pastor Williams pronounced us husband and wife, the church erupted in applause and tears. My mother was sobbing happy tears in the front row. My brother James was actually smiling instead of wearing his usual skeptical expression. Even my father's eyes were suspiciously bright when David kissed me and we turned to face our families as a married couple. The receiving line outside the church was a blur of hugs, congratulations, and photographs. My mother's friends from the school district where she worked as a librarian. My father's colleagues from the police department. David's family who had driven up from Cincinnati. Neighbors who had watched me grow up. Everyone was genuinely happy, genuinely celebrating what they saw as a young woman finally finding her place in the world. What they didn't notice were the three men in perfectly tailored suits who stood at strategic positions around the church grounds, speaking quietly into nearly invisible earpieces. What they couldn't see was the subtle hand signal David gave when we posed for photographs, indicating that our security detail was in position and all clear. What they had no way of understanding was that the simple gold wedding band I now wore contained a tracking device that would allow my location to be monitored from a secure facility 3 states away. The reception at the Millfield Community Center should have been the continuation of a perfect day. The venue had been transformed with more white roses, twinkling lights, and the kind of elegant simplicity that made everyone feel comfortable. The band, a local group that specialized in weddings and community events, played songs that spanned 3 generations, ensuring that everyone from my teenage cousins to my grandmother's bridge club could find something to dance to. David and I had our first dance to At Last by Etta James, a song we'd chosen because it reflected how we felt about finding each other despite the complications of our professional lives. As we swayed together in the center of the room, surrounded by everyone we loved, I allowed myself to believe that maybe I could have both lives, the classified career that fulfilled me professionally and the family relationships that grounded me personally. My father's toast was everything I could have hoped for. He spoke about watching me grow up, about worrying when I chose an unconventional path, and about how proud he was to see me find happiness with someone who clearly adored me. Sarah has always been determined to do things her own way, he said, raising his glass with a smile that reached his eyes for the first time in years. And while my mother and I haven't always understood her choices, we've never doubted her heart. Today, watching her marry David, I can see that her unconventional path has led her exactly where she belongs. The applause was thunderous, and I felt tears threatening to ruin my carefully applied makeup. For a moment, I imagined what it would be like to live in this version of reality permanently, where my father was proud of me, where my family celebrated my choices, where I didn't have to hide the most important aspects of my life. But even as I basked in the warmth of family acceptance, I was aware of the subtle signs that my other life was intruding on this perfect day. David's phone had buzzed discreetly 3 times during dinner. One of our security detail had repositioned himself near the kitchen entrance, and there was a tension in the air that had nothing to do with wedding day nerves and everything to do with the classified situation that was developing half a world away. The first real crack in the perfect facade came at 7:47 p.m. during the cake-cutting ceremony. My phone, which I had set to silent but kept in the small purse my mother had insisted I carry, vibrated with an emergency pattern that made my blood run cold. 3 short bursts, pause, 3 short bursts, pause, 3 long bursts.
SOS in Morse code, but in the military intelligence community, it meant something far more specific: immediate extraction required. I managed to maintain my smile as David and I cut the cake, fed each other small bites amid laughter and camera flashes, and accepted congratulations from the guests who surrounded us. But my mind was racing through protocols and possibilities. An emergency extraction on my wedding day meant something catastrophic was happening, either a direct threat to my safety or a situation so critical that my immediate presence was required regardless of personal circumstances. David, reading my expression with the skill of someone who'd worked with me in high-stress situations, smoothly maneuvered us away from the crowd toward a quiet corner near the community center's back exit. "Talk to me," he said quietly, his hand resting protectively on my lower back. Before I could respond, my father appeared beside us, his expression shifting from wedding day joy to the focused alertness of a veteran police officer who sensed trouble. "Everything okay over here? You both look like you've seen a ghost." "Just wedding day overwhelm," I said quickly, forcing a laugh that sounded artificial even to my own ears. "All the excitement catching up with us." But my father's instincts were too sharp to be fooled by a weak excuse. His eyes moved between David and me, taking in our body language, our expressions, the way we'd positioned ourselves near an exit. Years of police work had taught him to recognize when people were preparing to run. "Sarah," he said, using the tone he'd perfected during thousands of interrogations, "what's going on? And don't give me any more nonsense about being overwhelmed. I've been a cop for 30 years. I know what fear looks like." Before I could answer, the situation escalated beyond anything I could have prepared for. Officer Bradley Chen, no relation to David despite the name, burst through the community center's main entrance with the kind of urgency that immediately silenced the entire reception. He scanned the room quickly before his eyes locked on my father. "Chief Thompson," he called out, his voice carrying across the sudden quiet of 300 guests who had stopped mid-conversation to stare. "We need you immediately. Priority 1 situation." My father's expression hardened into the mask of command I'd seen countless times during my childhood. "What's the nature of the emergency, Chen?" "Federal intelligence indicates a potential security threat targeting local law enforcement families. We've been ordered to implement immediate protective protocols." The words hit the reception like a physical blow. Guests began murmuring nervously, some reaching for their phones, others looking toward the exits. My mother's face went pale as she processed the implication that her husband, her family, might be in danger. But I knew something the rest of the room didn't know. There was no federal threat targeting local law enforcement families in Millfield, Ohio. The emergency extraction signal on my phone, the sudden appearance of local police with urgent federal intelligence, these weren't coincidences. They were connected to whatever classified situation was developing overseas, and somehow, impossibly, my two worlds were colliding in real time. "Everyone remain calm," my father announced, his voice carrying the authority that had made him one of the most respected police chiefs in the state. "We're going to implement some precautionary measures while we assess the threat level. This is purely preventative." But as I watched him take control of the room, coordinating with his officers and organizing the guests, I realized with growing horror that I was about to become the center of a security investigation that would expose everything I'd been hiding. The classified life I'd worked so hard to protect was about to collide with the family relationships I treasured, and there was no protocol in any manual that could guide me through what was about to happen. David's hand found mine, squeezing gently in a gesture that meant, "Stay calm, we'll figure this out." But as I looked around the room at my family, my friends, my new husband, and the life we'd all believed we were celebrating, I knew that in the next few hours, everything would change forever. The perfect wedding day was over. What came next would test every assumption my family had ever made about who I really was. The next 15 minutes unfolded like a carefully choreographed nightmare that I was powerless to stop.
My father, in full police chief mode, had transformed the community center into a command post with military-like efficiency. Guests were being organized into groups, contact information was being collected, and officers were positioned at every exit. What had moments before been a joyous celebration was now a crime scene in waiting. "Sarah, David, I need you both to come with me," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "We need to get you somewhere secure while we assess the threat level."
I exchanged a glance with David, both of us understanding that we were trapped in an impossible situation. My emergency extraction protocols required me to leave immediately for a classified briefing that could determine the outcome of international operations. But my father's protective instincts, triggered by false intelligence that I couldn't explain without revealing classified information, were creating a security incident that threatened to expose everything. "Dad, I really think this might be an overreaction," I said carefully, trying to find a way to de-escalate without revealing what I knew. "Maybe we should wait for more information before—" "Sarah Elizabeth Thompson," he interrupted, using my full name with the sharp edge it carried when I was in serious trouble. "I have been protecting this family and this community for 30 years. When federal intelligence indicates a credible threat, we take action. We don't wait and hope for the best." Detective James Thompson, my brother, had appeared at my father's shoulder with a grim expression that I'd rarely seen during family gatherings. "Chief, we've got a problem. The federal contact who provided the initial intelligence warning has gone dark. No response to verification requests." My blood went cold. The federal contact had undoubtedly been someone from my own organization, attempting to facilitate my emergency extraction without revealing classified information. But now, that contact had gone silent, probably because the overseas situation had escalated beyond the point where maintaining my cover was the priority. "What does that mean?" my mother asked, her voice tight with fear as she joined our impromptu family conference. "What kind of danger are we talking about?" My father's expression darkened. "It means we're operating blind, which is exactly when things go sideways. Patricia, I need you to go with Officer Martinez. She's going to take you and the other family members to the station where we can provide better security." "I'm not leaving without Sarah," my mother said firmly, grabbing my arm with surprising strength. "If my daughter is in danger, I'm staying right here." "Mom, please," I said, my mind racing through increasingly desperate options. "Just do what Dad says. I'll be fine." But even as I spoke, I could see the situation spiraling beyond anyone's control. My phone vibrated again with the emergency extraction pattern, more insistent this time. David's jaw was tight with the kind of tension that meant he was receiving similar communications through his own classified channels. And my father was making decisions based on incomplete information that was leading him toward a confrontation with forces he couldn't begin to understand. The moment everything went irreversibly wrong came at 8:23 p.m. when FBI agent Rebecca Morrison walked through the community center doors. I recognized her immediately, though my family had no way of knowing that Agent Morrison and I had worked together on 3 separate operations over the past 2 years. She was one of the few federal agents with the security clearance to know about my real identity and rank. She was also apparently the source of the intelligence that had triggered this entire security response. "Chief Thompson," Agent Morrison said, approaching our family group with the kind of focused intensity that made everyone else in the room seem to fade into background noise. "Chief Thompson, I'm Agent Morrison, FBI. We spoke on the phone about the potential security threat." My father straightened into his most professional posture. "Agent Morrison? What's the status of the threat assessment?" "That's what I'm here to determine," she said, her eyes moving between David and me with an expression I couldn't read. "I need to speak with the potential targets privately to assess their security exposure." "Of course," my father said immediately. "Sarah, David, Agent Morrison needs to debrief you about the threat. Let's move this to a secure location." But as we began walking toward the community center's back office, Agent Morrison's radio crackled to life with a transmission that changed everything. Control to Morrison. Suspect has been identified. Repeat, primary suspect identified. Subject is armed and considered extremely dangerous. Initiate immediate containment protocols. My father's hand moved instinctively to his weapon. Agent Morrison, what suspect? What containment protocols? Agent Morrison's expression hardened as she looked directly at me. Chief Thompson, based on federal intelligence analysis, we have reason to believe that someone at this event has been providing classified information to foreign operatives, someone with access to sensitive intelligence who has been using their position to coordinate activities that threaten national security. The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. I could see my father processing the words, see the moment when his protective instincts shifted from shielding his family from an external threat to considering the possibility that the threat might be internal. That's impossible, my mother said immediately. Everyone here is family and close friends. There's no one here who had access to classified information. But my father's eyes had found mine, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind. My vague answers about my military work, my inability to provide details about my assignments, my frequent overseas travel that I could never explain, my nervous behavior throughout the evening. To a seasoned police officer, my entire history suddenly looked like a pattern of suspicious activity. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice carrying a new quality that I'd never heard before. "Agent Morrison, you said someone with access to classified information. What kind of access are we talking about?" "High-level military intelligence. Someone with the clearance and authority to access operational details that could compromise ongoing missions and endanger personnel."
The silence that followed was deafening. 300 wedding guests were scattered throughout the community center, unaware that in this back corner, my entire life was imploding. My family was staring at me with expressions ranging from confusion to growing suspicion. And Agent Morrison was waiting for me to respond to accusations that I couldn't address without revealing classified information. "This is ridiculous," David said, stepping slightly in front of me in a protective gesture that only made me look more guilty. "Sarah works in administrative support. She doesn't have access to operational intelligence." But my father had been a police officer too long to miss the subtle cues that suggested David was lying. The protective positioning, the defensive tone, the way his hand had moved toward his jacket pocket where, my father's trained eye would notice, there was a suspicious bulge that could be a concealed weapon. "Agent Morrison," my father said, his voice taking on the official tone he used when making arrests, "I think we need to separate these individuals and conduct formal interviews. If there's a legitimate security concern, we need to treat this as a federal investigation." "Absolutely agreed," Agent Morrison said, pulling out handcuffs with practiced efficiency. "Sarah Thompson, you're being detained for questioning regarding suspected violations of the Espionage Act and conspiracy to provide classified information to foreign agents." The words hit like physical blows. My mother gasped audibly. My brother's hand moved to his own weapon. And my father, the man who had walked me down the aisle just 4 hours earlier, watched with professional approval as federal agents prepared to arrest his daughter at her own wedding reception. "This is insane," I said, finding my voice for the first time since the accusations began. "Dad, you know me. You know I would never betray my country. You know I would never do anything to endanger innocent people." But as I looked into his eyes, I realized with growing horror that he didn't know me at all. For 28 years, I had been a mystery to him, a daughter whose choices he couldn't understand, whose work he couldn't fathom, whose life seemed to follow patterns that made no sense. Now, suddenly, those patterns were being reframed as evidence of criminal activity, and everything I had thought was protecting my family was being used to destroy us. "Sarah Elizabeth Thompson," Agent Morrison said, approaching with handcuffs, "you are under arrest for suspected violations of federal espionage laws. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the cold metal of the handcuffs closed around my wrists, I looked around at my family's faces. Shock, betrayal, fear,
And worst of all, my father's expression of professional duty overriding paternal love. This was the moment I had spent 10 years trying to prevent. This was the collision of worlds that I believed would destroy everything I cared about. But as Agent Morrison led me toward the community center's exit, past 300 wedding guests who were now witnessing the bride being arrested by federal agents, I realized that the real destruction was just beginning. Because while my family thought they were watching me being arrested for treason, the truth was far more complicated and far more dangerous than any of them could possibly imagine. The perfect wedding day had become a federal case, and I was about to learn whether the bonds of family could survive the revelation that everything they thought they knew about me was a carefully constructed lie. The Millfield Police Department had never processed a federal espionage case before. The small-town facility, designed for handling drunk and disorderly arrests and the occasional domestic dispute, was completely unprepared for the security protocols that Agent Morrison insisted were necessary for someone accused of compromising national security. As they led me through the familiar hallways where I'd spent countless hours childhood waiting for my father to finish paperwork, I felt like I was walking through a funhouse mirror version of my own life. The interrogation room was the same sterile gray box where my father had questioned thousands of suspects over his career. The same metal table, the same uncomfortable chairs, the same two-way mirror that had fascinated me as a child when he'd explained how they could watch without being seen. But now, I was on the wrong side of that table, wearing handcuffs and a wedding dress, facing accusations that could destroy not just my career, but my entire identity. Agent Morrison sat across from me, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes sharp with an intelligence that made me wonder if she was playing a role or genuinely believed I was guilty of the crime she had described. Beside her sat Detective James Thompson, my own brother, whose presence felt like the ultimate betrayal. The family dinner conversations where we joked about criminals and crime scenes never prepared me for the moment when I would become the suspect he was investigating. For the record, Agent Morrison began, activating a digital recorder that looked far more sophisticated than anything the Millfield Police Department typically used. This is a preliminary interview with Sarah Elizabeth Thompson, conducted on November 15, 2024, regarding suspected violations of the Espionage Act and conspiracy to provide classified information to foreign agents. Each word felt like a nail being driven into the coffin of my old life. Sarah Elizabeth Thompson, the disappointing daughter who'd never lived up to her family's expectations, was officially being accused of crimes that carried life sentences. The irony was so profound it was almost funny, if it weren't destroying everyone I love in the process. "Mrs. Thompson," Agent Morrison said, emphasizing my new married name in a way that made it sound like evidence of criminal conspiracy, "you've been read your rights. Do you understand the charges being investigated?"
"I understand the accusations," I said carefully, my voice steadier than I felt. "But I don't understand how any of this relates to my actual work or circumstances." My brother leaned forward with the expression he'd perfected during his detective training. "Sarah, help us understand your circumstances. Because from where we're sitting, your behavior tonight looks exactly like someone who was trying to leave the country under suspicious circumstances." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Leave the country? James, I was getting married. This is my wedding day. A wedding that provided perfect cover for a clandestine meeting, Agent Morrison interjected smoothly. "Our intelligence indicates that foreign operatives have been using social events and family gatherings to coordinate espionage activities. A wedding reception with hundreds of guests would provide ideal cover for passing information or coordinating an extraction." I stared at her in disbelief. The emergency extraction protocols that had been activated were designed to protect national security, not compromise it. But from their perspective, my inability to explain the classified communications and security measures looked exactly like criminal activity. "Agent Morrison," I said, trying to find some way to defend myself without revealing classified information,
I think there's been a serious misunderstanding about my role and my activities. I'm not involved in anything that threatens national security. Then explain the encrypted communications, my brother said, pulling out evidence bags that made my heart sink. Explain the sophisticated electronic devices we found in your possession. Explain why you've been traveling internationally under multiple identities. The evidence spread across the table told a story that looked damning from any conventional law enforcement perspective. My secure phone, which appeared to be a sophisticated encryption device, my diplomatic passport, which suggested access to classified travel, various technical equipment that could easily be mistaken for espionage tools. From the outside, it looked exactly like the toolkit of a professional spy. James, I said desperately, you've known me your entire life. Do you really believe I'm capable of betraying my country? But the question seemed to hit him harder than I had expected. His expression shifted from professional skepticism to something much more personal and painful. Sarah, I don't know what you're capable of anymore. For 10 years, you've been living a life that none of us understand. You disappear for months at a time with explanations that never quite make sense. You have money and resources that don't match your supposed job. You speak languages you never learned in school. You know things about international events that you shouldn't know unless... He trailed off, but the implication was clear. Unless I was involved in exactly the kind of activities they suspected. The door to the interrogation room opened, and my father entered with the kind of controlled composure that meant he was fighting powerful emotions. He took the seat across from me, and for a moment, we just stared at each other across the metal table that now represented everything that had gone wrong between us. Sweetheart, he said quietly, using the endearment that he'd called me since childhood, I need you to help me understand what's happening here, because the evidence suggests that my daughter has been living a double life that threatens everything I've spent my career protecting. The pain in his voice was almost unbearable. This man had dedicated his life to serving and protecting his community, and now he was being forced to consider the possibility that his own daughter was everything he'd sworn to defend against. The irony that I had been protecting the same values, just on a larger scale, was lost in the maze of classified protocols that prevented me from explaining the truth. Dad, I said, my voice breaking slightly, I know how this looks. I know the evidence seems damning, but I need you to trust that everything I've done has been in service of the same principles you taught me growing up. What principles? He asked, his voice rising slightly. What principles involve lying to your family for a decade? What principles involve carrying encrypted communications devices and traveling under false identities? Before I could answer, Agent Morrison's radio crackled to life with a transmission that changed the entire dynamic of the room. Control to Morrison. Priority override. Stand down all interrogation activities immediately. Federal jurisdiction transfer in progress. Agent Morrison's expression shifted from confident control to visible confusion. Control, please repeat. Did you say stand down? Affirmative. Immediate cessation of all interrogation activities. Subject is to be held pending arrival of Federal Oversight Team. ETA 15 minutes. My father looked between Agent Morrison and the radio with the sharp attention of someone who'd spent decades interpreting law enforcement communications. Agent Morrison, what's Federal Oversight? I thought this was already a federal investigation. It was, she said, her professional composure showing the first cracks of uncertainty. But I don't understand why jurisdiction would be transferred if we're already handling this as a federal case. But I understood, and the realization filled me with a mixture of relief and terror. The emergency extraction protocols had finally reached the level where maintaining my cover was less important than preventing a catastrophic breach of national security. Someone with higher authority than Agent Morrison had decided that the truth needed to come out, regardless of the personal consequences. Sarah,
my brother said, noticing my expression. You look like you know what's happening. What aren't you telling us? Before I could answer, the interrogation room door opened again, and a man in a dark suit entered with the kind of presence that immediately commanded attention. He was followed by a woman in military dress uniform whose bearing and insignia indicated a rank high enough to make even experienced law enforcement officers stand at attention. "Agent Morrison," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "This investigation is being terminated immediately."
Sir, Agent Morrison protested, we have credible evidence of espionage activity. The suspect, the woman in military uniform interrupted, is Colonel Sarah Thompson, United States Army Intelligence Command. She has been operating under deep cover for the past 5 years, and this investigation has compromised an ongoing national security operation. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. My father's face had gone completely pale. My brother's mouth was hanging open. Agent Morrison looked like she'd been struck by lightning. "Colonel?" my father whispered, his voice barely audible. The woman in uniform stepped forward and extended my hand. "Colonel Thompson, I'm General Patricia Hayes, Joint Chiefs Intelligence Division. I apologize for the circumstances, but we need to debrief you immediately regarding the overseas situation that triggered your extraction protocols." As she spoke, she produced a key and moved to unlock my handcuffs, a gesture that seemed to break whatever spell had been holding the room in stunned silence. My father stood up so quickly that his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Colonel," he repeated, louder this time, "my daughter is a colonel in the United States Army?" General Hayes maintained her professional composure, but I could see the recognition in her eyes that she was witnessing a family crisis that went beyond military protocol. "Chief Thompson, your daughter has been serving her country with distinction for over a decade. She's one of the youngest officers ever promoted to colonel in Army intelligence, and her work has had direct impact on national security operations across 4 continents. Agent Morrison, who had been silent since the federal oversight team arrived, finally found her voice. "General Hayes, if Colonel Thompson is a legitimate intelligence officer, then why was she flagged by our counterintelligence monitoring? Why did her communication patterns trigger espionage protocols?" The question hung in the air, and I realized that even I didn't fully understand what had triggered the investigation that had destroyed my wedding day. General Hayes exchanged a glance with Deputy Director Harrison before answering. "Agent Morrison, the patterns you identified were legitimate intelligence communications related to an ongoing operation in Eastern Europe. However, those communications were intercepted and misinterpreted by a monitoring system that wasn't cleared to recognize military intelligence protocols. What you saw as suspicious activity was actually Colonel Thompson coordinating a response to a critical situation that developed this morning." My father stood up abruptly and walked to the small window that looked out onto the parking lot where his officers were still processing guests from my wedding reception. "Eastern Europe. This morning. The morning of your wedding. Dad, I never wanted any of this to happen. I never wanted my work to interfere with your work." He turned around and I could see tears in his eyes. "Sarah, I've spent 10 years thinking you were wasting your life. 10 years worrying that you were throwing away your potential on some meaningless desk job. 10 years feeling like I'd failed as a father because I couldn't understand why my daughter was settling for so little." The pain in his voice was almost unbearable. "You didn't fail as a father." "Didn't I?" His voice rose slightly. "My daughter has been serving her country as a colonel in Army intelligence, preventing terrorist attacks and saving lives, and I've been treating her like a disappointment who couldn't figure out how to have a real career?" James finally spoke up, his voice rough with emotion. "Sarah, when you came home for Christmas last year and Mom asked what you'd been doing, you said you'd been working on logistics coordination. What were you actually doing?" I looked at General Hayes, who gave me a slight nod indicating I was cleared to share certain details.
I was coordinating a joint operation with NATO allies to intercept a weapons shipment that was being moved through 3 countries. The logistics coordination involved tracking the movement of illegal arms and coordinating with international law enforcement to intercept them before they reached terrorist cells in Western Europe. Jesus Christ, James whispered. And when you said you couldn't talk about work because of military protocol?
Because the details were classified at levels that require security clearances higher than most generals have, General Hayes answered for me. Colonel Thompson's work involves operations so sensitive that even acknowledging their existence could compromise national security. Deputy Director Harrison stepped forward, consulting a tablet that had been buzzing with incoming messages. Colonel Thompson, I need to brief you on the current situation. The operation in Eastern Europe has escalated. We have confirmed intelligence of an imminent attack on a NATO facility, and your familiarity with the terrorist cell's communication patterns is critical to preventing casualties. The weight of responsibility settled back on my shoulders like a familiar burden. Even in this moment of personal crisis, people's lives depended on decisions I would help make in the next few hours. What's the timeline? 18 hours maximum. We have a secure facility in Columbus where you can coordinate with the international team. Transport is standing by. My father had been listening to this exchange with the expression of someone trying to process information that didn't fit into any category his mind was prepared to handle. You're leaving? Now? In the middle of all this? Dad, I said, standing up and facing him across the small room, this is what I do. This is who I am. I coordinate responses to threats that could kill innocent people. I can't turn that off just because our family is having a crisis. But it's your wedding day, my mother's voice came from the doorway, where she had appeared with eyes red from crying and confusion written across her face. How can you just leave on your wedding day? The question hit harder than any interrogation technique. How could I explain that duty and service weren't things you could schedule around personal milestones? How could I make them understand that the work I did didn't pause for weddings or holidays or family emergencies? Mrs. Thompson, General Hayes said gently, your daughter's expertise is the difference between preventing an attack and responding to one. The choice she's making right now to put duty before personal comfort is exactly why she's earned the rank and respect she has. But my mother wasn't looking at General Hayes. She was staring at me with an expression of hurt and bewilderment that cut straight through my professional composure. Sarah, I don't understand any of this. I don't understand who you are anymore. For 28 years, I thought I knew my daughter, and now I find out that everything I believed was wrong. The accusation in her voice was worse than anything Agent Morrison had thrown at me during the interrogation. This wasn't about criminal activity or national security violations. This was about trust, honesty, and the fundamental relationships that defined who I was as a person. Mom, I said, my voice breaking slightly, I'm the same person I've always been. I'm still your daughter. I still love this family more than anything in the world. The only thing that's changed is that now you know what I've been doing with my life. Is it? She asked, tears streaming down her face, because the daughter I raised would never have lied to her family for 10 years. The daughter I raised would have trusted us enough to tell us the truth about something this important. The words hit like physical blows, because they carried a grain of truth that I'd been avoiding for years. I had made choices that prioritized security over honesty, duty over family relationships, professional success over personal connections. The classified nature of my work had provided a convenient excuse for emotional distance that had probably gone far beyond what was actually necessary. David appeared in the doorway behind me, still wearing his wedding tuxedo, but looking like he'd aged a decade in the past 2 hours. Sarah, we need to talk. Privately. General Hayes looked at her tablet again. Colonel Thompson, I understand this is difficult, but we really do need to move on the transportation. The situation in Eastern Europe is deteriorating rapidly. I found myself caught between competing loyalties that seemed impossible to reconcile. My family, who had just learned that their understanding of me was fundamentally wrong and needed time to process that revelation. My husband, who had married me knowing exactly who I was, but was now dealing with the aftermath of that truth being exposed in the worst possible way. and my duty as a military officer, which required me to prioritize national security over personal relationships, even when those relationships were falling apart in real time. 5 minutes, I said to General Hayes. I need 5 minutes with my family before I leave. She nodded reluctantly. 5 minutes, but Colonel, lives are at stake. As the federal official stepped out of the room, I was left alone with my family for the first time since the revelation. The interrogation room that had felt like a hostile environment moments before now felt intimate and fragile, like a space where we might be able to begin rebuilding what had been broken. "David," I said, turning to my husband, "I'm so sorry. This isn't how I wanted you to meet my family as my husband." He managed a weak smile. "Sweetheart, I knew your family didn't know about your real work. I just didn't expect to find out by watching you get arrested at our wedding reception." "Sarah," my father said, his voice carrying a weight I'd never heard before, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. When you were growing up, when I was dismissive of your choices and critical of your decisions, did I push you away from this family? Did I make you feel like you couldn't trust us with important parts of your life?"
The question was so direct, so vulnerably honest, that it cut through all the professional protocols and classified restrictions to the heart of what had really gone wrong between us. Because while the security clearance requirements had prevented me from sharing details about my work, the emotional distance that had grown between us over the years had deeper roots than government secrecy. "Dad," I said quietly, "we all made choices that led us here, but right now, I need you to understand that I have to go. People's lives depend on decisions that will be made in the next few hours, and I'm one of the people who helps make those decisions." He nodded slowly, the police chief in him understanding duty even when the father in him wanted to keep his daughter close. "Go," he said. "Do what you need to do. But Sarah, when this is over, when you've saved whoever needs saving, you come home, and we figure out how to be a family that knows who you really are." As I hugged my parents goodbye and kissed David one more time, I realized that the hardest part of this day wasn't the false arrest or the blown cover or even the international crisis that was pulling me away. The hardest part was the knowledge that when I returned, everything about my relationships with the people I loved most would be different. The masquerade was over, but the real work of being honest with each other was just beginning. The secure facility in Columbus was a stark contrast to the small-town police station where my life had imploded just hours earlier. Hidden beneath an unremarkable office building, the underground command center buzzed with the kind of controlled urgency that I had become accustomed to over the past decade. Multiple screens displayed satellite imagery, communication intercepts, and real-time intelligence feeds from across Eastern Europe. But as I sat in the briefing room, still wearing my wedding dress, I felt the surreal disconnect between my personal catastrophe and the international crisis that demanded my complete attention. "Colonel Thompson," General Hayes said, settling into the chair across from me with a thick classified folder, "I know this day has been difficult for you personally, but I need you to compartmentalize that and focus on the situation at hand. We have 18 hours to prevent what our intelligence suggests could be the most significant terrorist attack on European soil since Madrid." I forced myself to shift into the mental space that had defined my career, where personal considerations became secondary to operational necessities. What's the target and what's the timeline? NATO's Eastern Command facility in Poland. Intelligence intercepts suggest a coordinated attack using stolen military-grade explosives. The terrorist cell you've been tracking for the past 8 months has acquired the materials and is moving toward final positioning. The words cut through my emotional exhaustion like a blade. The Kovac network. I'd been hunting these operatives since they'd first appeared on intelligence radar, tracking their communications, mapping their connections, understanding their operational patterns. The idea that they were hours away from executing a major attack felt like a personal failure. "Do we have confirmation on the explosive materials?" I asked, my mind already shifting into analytical mode. "Partial confirmation. The shipment was stolen from a Ukrainian military depot 3 weeks ago. Our assets in the region have been tracking movement, but the cell went dark 48 hours ago. That's when we activated your extraction protocols.
We needed your specific knowledge of their communication patterns to re-establish contact. I nodded, understanding now why my wedding day had been sacrificed to national security. The Kovac network had developed sophisticated encryption methods that I'd spent months learning to decode. Without that knowledge, intelligence agencies were operating blind during the most critical phase of the operation. Who else is in on the briefing? International Task Force, representatives from Polish intelligence, NATO security, German counterterrorism, and FBI International Division. They're waiting for your analysis before finalizing response strategies. As we walked toward the main briefing room, I caught a glimpse of myself in a security mirror and almost didn't recognize the person staring back. The carefully styled wedding hair was now disheveled, the makeup smeared from stress and tears, and the white dress wrinkled and stained from the handcuffs and the interrogation room. I looked like someone who had been through a battle, which in many ways I had. The briefing room contained 12 of the most senior intelligence officers from 4 different countries, all of whom stood when I entered. The recognition and respect in their faces was a stark contrast to the suspicion and disappointment I had seen in my family's eyes just hours before. Here, I wasn't the disappointing daughter or the suspected traitor. I was Colonel Thompson, the officers whose expertise might save hundreds of lives. "Colonel," said Director Klaus Weber from German intelligence, a man I'd worked with on 3 previous operations, "we're grateful you could join us under these circumstances. We understand today was supposed to be a personal celebration." "Director Weber," I replied, settling into the chair at the head of the conference table, "the circumstances are what they are. Let's focus on preventing this attack." For the next 4 hours, I immersed myself completely in the operational details that had defined my career. We analyzed communication intercepts, reviewed satellite imagery, and developed response scenarios that balanced the need to prevent the attack with the imperative to capture the operatives for intelligence gathering. It was the kind of complex, multi-layered operation that required expertise built over years of experience. But even as I coordinated with international agencies and developed tactical responses, part of my mind kept drifting back to the interrogation room in Millfield. My father's expression when he learned I was a colonel, my mother's tears when she realized I'd been lying to her for a decade, David's attempt to process the fact that our wedding day had become an international incident.
Colonel Thompson, interrupted Agent Sandra Mitchell from the FBI's International Division, "you seem distracted. Is everything all right?" The question snapped me back to the present, and I realized that my personal crisis was affecting my professional performance in ways that could have catastrophic consequences. "I'm fine, Agent Mitchell. Continue with the tactical assessment." But General Hayes had noticed my distraction as well. During a brief break in the briefing, she pulled me aside for a conversation that I knew was coming, but had been dreading. "Sarah," she said, using my first name in a way that immediately shifted our interaction from official to personal, "I've worked with you for 5 years. I've never seen you lose focus during an operation, but tonight you're not operating at full capacity." "General, I can handle the mission requirements," I said defensively. "I'm not questioning your ability to handle the mission. I'm questioning whether it's fair to ask you to handle it under these circumstances." She paused, studying my face with the kind of careful attention that had made her one of the most effective military leaders I'd ever worked with. "Your family just discovered that everything they thought they knew about you was wrong. Your wedding day became a federal investigation. Your husband is probably sitting in a hotel room trying to process the fact that he married someone whose life is so classified that her own parents didn't know who she really was." The summary of my personal disasters was accurate and devastating. "What are you suggesting, General?" "I'm suggesting that maybe, for once, we let someone else handle the crisis. Agent Mitchell has been briefed on your communication analysis. Director Weber has operational experience with this type of attack. The task force can proceed without your direct involvement." The offer was tempting in ways that surprised me. For 10 years, I'd prioritized duty over every personal consideration. I'd missed family holidays, delayed relationships, and sacrificed countless personal moments for the demands of national security. The opportunity to choose my family over my mission was almost unprecedented in my career. But as I looked back into the briefing room at the 12 intelligence officers who were depending on my expertise, I realized that stepping away now would betray everything I'd worked to build. The Kovac network had killed civilians in 3 different countries. The attack they were planning could result in hundreds of casualties. My personal problems, no matter how devastating, couldn't outweigh the potential loss of innocent lives. General, I appreciate the offer, but I need to see this through. My family has waited 10 years to understand who I really am. They can wait 18 more hours to see me finish the job. General Hayes nodded with an expression that mixed approval with sympathy. Sarah, when this operation is complete, I want you to take extended leave, real leave, not the fake vacations where you monitor communications and brief replacements. Time to rebuild whatever can be rebuilt with your family. Understood, General. We returned to the briefing room where the International Task Force was finalizing operational plans based on my communication analysis. The next 12 hours would involve coordinated surveillance, strategic positioning, and precise timing to intercept the terrorist cell before they could execute their attack. It was the kind of operation that required split-second decisions and flawless execution. But at 3:47 a.m., as I sat in the command center, monitoring communication intercepts and coordinating with field teams across Eastern Europe, my secure phone buzzed with a personal message that momentarily shattered my professional focus. Sarah, it's Dad. I don't understand your world, but I'm proud of what you're doing. Come home safe. We'll figure out the rest together. The message had somehow been cleared through security protocols, which meant someone had authorized personal communication during an active operation. I looked up to find General Hayes watching me from across the command center, and she gave me a slight nod that confirmed she'd arranged for the message to reach me. For the first time in hours, I smiled, not the professional expression I wore during briefings, but a genuine smile that reflected a possibility I'd thought was lost forever, the possibility that my family might eventually understand and accept the choices I'd made with my life. The operation continued, but now I was fighting not just to prevent a terrorist attack, but to protect the future that might finally allow me to be both Colonel Thompson and Sarah Thompson at the same time. As dawn approached and the final phase of the mission began, I realized that the next few hours would determine not just whether we prevented an international tragedy, but whether I could salvage the family relationships that had been destroyed by a lifetime of necessary secrets. The most critical part of the operation was about to begin, and everything I cared about, both professional and personal, hung in the balance. At 6:23 a.m. Eastern European Time, everything changed. I was monitoring communication intercepts in the Columbus Command Center when Agent Kowalski from Polish intelligence burst through the secure door with an expression that made my blood run cold. Colonel Thompson, we have movement. The Kovac cell has accelerated their timeline. They're not waiting for tonight. They're moving on the NATO facility now.
90 minutes to prevent what could be the deadliest terrorist attack in European recent history. 90 minutes to coordinate assets across international borders and multiple agencies. 90 minutes to justify every sacrifice I'd made, every family relationship I damaged, every personal moment I'd surrendered for my career. General Hayes, I called across the command center. We need to activate all contingency protocols immediately. This is no longer a planned operation. We're in crisis response mode. The next 20 minutes were a controlled explosion of activity. Secure communications lines opened to field teams across Poland. NATO security forces received emergency authorization to engage. International law enforcement agencies coordinated jurisdictional protocols. And at the center of it all, I found myself making decisions that would determine whether hundreds of innocent people lived or died. Colonel? Director Weber's voice crackled through the secure line from Berlin. Our assets are in position, but we need confirmation on the explosive device specifications before we can determine safe engagement distances. That was the critical piece. Understanding exactly what type of device the Kovac network had constructed would determine whether our response teams could neutralize the threat or whether evacuation was the only viable option. And the only way to get that information was through the communication intercepts that I'd spent 8 months learning to decode. Agent Mitchell, I said, turning to the FBI representative, I need complete satellite coverage of the approach routes. If we can intercept that communications during the final approach, I can determine device specifications from their operational chatter. For the next 30 minutes, I worked with an intensity that blocked out everything else. The exhaustion from my ruined wedding day, the emotional devastation of my family crisis, even the physical discomfort of coordinating an international operation while wearing a wrinkled wedding dress. Nothing existed except the communication patterns scrolling across my screens and the lives that depended on my ability to interpret them correctly. At 7:03 a.m., I caught the break we needed. There, I said, highlighting a transmission that had been automatically flagged by our monitoring systems. Vehicle 2, device status report. Listen to the background noise. They're testing the timer mechanism. I enhanced the audio, filtering out road noise and static until the subtle electronic tones were clearly audible. After 8 months of studying this particular cell's methods, I could identify their preferred timing devices by sound alone. 45-minute delay timer. Check military specifications. That's a shaped charge design, probably C4 with metal fragment enhancement. Blast radius will be approximately 200 meters, but the timer gives us a window for bomb disposal if we can intercept before they reach the target. General Hayes immediately activated the tactical response. All units, you have confirmation on device type and timing. Engagement is authorized. Repeat, engagement is authorized. What followed was the most intense hour of my career. Through satellite feeds and radio communications, I coordinated the takedown of a terrorist cell while sitting in an underground facility 3,000 miles away. Polish special forces moved to intercept the primary vehicle. German counterterrorism units positioned themselves to cut off escape routes. NATO security forces evacuated the target facility and established a perimeter. And at the center of it all, I tracked the Kovac network's communications, translating their coded messages and anticipating their tactical responses in real time. Colonel Thompson. Agent Kowalski's voice was tight with tension. Vehicle 1 has stopped. They're arguing about something. Can you interpret? I listened to the intercepted communication, my mind automatically translating the mixture of Serbian and coded phrases that the cell used for operational security. What I heard made my heart sink. They know they're being tracked, I announced to the command center. Vehicle 1 is discussing whether to abandon the mission or accelerate the attack. Vehicle 2 is already at the perimeter. They're planning to detonate immediately rather than risk capture. The silence that followed was deafening. All our careful planning, all the international coordination, all the resources we'd deployed, none of it mattered if the terrorists decided to trigger their device before our forces could intervene. Colonel, General Hayes said quietly, options? I stared at the communication feeds, processing information with the kind of desperate clarity that comes when everything you've worked for hangs in the balance. The Kovac network was 300 meters from the NATO facility. Our response teams were 800 meters out. The shaped charge they were carrying could kill anyone within a 200-meter radius. But there was one factor they didn't know we knew about: their backup communication system. They have a secondary frequency, I said, my fingers flying across the keyboard to access intercepts from previous operations. When they think primary communications are compromised, they switch to a civilian radio frequency that they assume we're not monitoring. Are we monitoring it? We are now, I said, redirecting satellite coverage to scan civilian radio frequencies in the target area. If I can break into their backup communications, I can send false instructions that might delay their attack. What I was proposing was essentially hacking into a terrorist communication network and impersonating their command structure, a technique that violated multiple international laws and could create diplomatic incidents if it was discovered. But with lives hanging in the balance, legal considerations became secondary to operational necessity. Colonel Thompson. Director Weber's voice carried a warning. What you're describing could have significant political ramifications if... Director, I interrupted. In approximately 15 minutes, those ramifications will be irrelevant if we don't stop this attack. General Hayes met my eyes across the command center. Do it.
The next 12 minutes were the longest of my life. Using communication protocols I'd reverse-engineered for months of surveillance, I inserted false messages into the Kovach network's backup frequency. Messages that suggested their target had been changed. Messages that indicated their timing was off. Messages designed to create enough confusion to delay their attack until our response teams could close the distance. Vehicle 2 has stopped, Agent Kowalski reported. They're receiving some kind of transmission. Through the satellite feed, I watched the terrorist operatives arguing over conflicting instructions. My false communications were working, but I couldn't tell if the delay would be enough. All units, final approach authorized, General Hayes announced. You have clearance for tactical engagement. What happened next unfolded with the kind of precision that justified years of international training and coordination. Polish special forces surrounded Vehicle 2 while the occupants were still debating their conflicting orders. German counterterrorism units intercepted Vehicle 1 before it could reach the facility perimeter. NATO bomb disposal experts secured the explosive device with 47 seconds remaining on the timer. 0 casualties, 0 property damage, complete mission success. As confirmations flooded in from field teams across Poland, the command center erupted in the kind of controlled celebration that follows successful counterterrorism operations. Handshakes, congratulations, and relief that hundreds of lives had been saved. But as I sat in my chair, still wearing my wedding dress, still processing the magnitude of what had just happened, I felt an overwhelming sense of emotional exhaustion that had nothing to do with the mission and everything to do with the personal cost of the life I'd chosen. Colonel Thompson, General Hayes said, approaching my workstation, exceptional work. Your communication analysis and tactical intervention saved lives today. Thank you, General. Sarah, she continued, using my first name again, you've been awake for 26 hours, you coordinated an international counterterrorism operation while wearing a wedding dress, and you prevented a major attack just hours after your family learned you exist. I think it's time to go home. Home. The word carried weight that I hadn't fully appreciated until this moment. For 10 years, home had been wherever my mission required me to be. But now, for the first time in my career, home meant something specific. A family in Millfield, Ohio, who were waiting to understand who their daughter really was. General, I said, standing up from my workstation, I think you're right. As I walked toward the exit of the command center, leaving behind the screens and communications equipment that had defined my identity for a decade, I realized that the most challenging part of my day was still ahead of me. Preventing a terrorist attack had been difficult, but it was work I'd trained for and understood. Rebuilding a family relationship that had been built on fundamental misunderstandings, that was going to require skills I'd never learned in any military training program. The drive back to Millfield took 3 hours through Ohio farmland that looked exactly the same as it had 36 hours earlier, but everything felt fundamentally different. I'd changed out of my wedding dress at the Columbus facility, trading it for military fatigues that felt more authentic than any civilian clothes I'd worn in years. But as familiar landmarks appeared through the windshield of the government sedan, I realized I was returning to my hometown as someone my own family had never met. The small town looked peaceful in the afternoon sunlight. Tree-lined streets, modest homes with well-maintained lawns, the kind of community where everyone knew their neighbors and major scandals usually involved the high school football team. But I knew that behind the tranquil facade, my family was grappling with revelations that had shattered their understanding of reality. Agent Morrison, who had volunteered to drive me back despite the embarrassment of the false arrest, finally broke the silence that had lasted most of the trip. Colonel Thompson, I want to apologize again for the investigation. The intelligence we received was convincing, but
obviously. Agent Morrison, I interrupted gently, you were doing your job based on the information available to you. In your position, I would have made the same decisions. But even as I said the words, I was thinking about the deeper implications of what had happened. The false arrest hadn't occurred in a vacuum. It had been possible because my family's lack of knowledge about my real life had made me look exactly like the kind of person who might be involved in espionage activities. The very secrecy that had protected my operations had made me vulnerable to accusations that could have destroyed everything I had worked for. How do you think they'll react? Agent Morrison asked as we turned onto the street where I had grown up. Your family, I mean. Learning that their daughter has been living a completely different life than what they believed. It was the question I had been avoiding for the past 6 hours. How do you rebuild relationships that were founded on fundamental misunderstandings? How do you explain a decade of necessary lies to people who felt betrayed by your choices? How do you balance the pride you feel in your accomplishments with the guilt over the pain those accomplishments had caused the people you loved most? I honestly don't know, I admitted as we pulled into the driveway of my childhood home. The house looks smaller than I remembered, a modest 2-story colonial with the American flag my father had hung from the front porch every morning for the past 20 years. But there were cars in the driveway that didn't belong to my immediate family. My aunt and uncle's sedan, my cousin's pickup truck, vehicles that suggested this would be more than a simple family reunion.
Before I could ring the doorbell, the front door opened to reveal my mother, who looked like she'd aged years in the days since I'd last seen her. Her eyes were red from crying, her usually perfect hair disheveled, and her expression carried the kind of emotional exhaustion that comes from processing information that doesn't fit into any familiar category. Sarah, she said quietly, stepping onto the porch and closing the door behind her, we need to talk before you go inside. My heart sank. The private conversation before I could see the rest of the family meant the situation was worse than I'd hoped. Mom, what's wrong? The whole family is here, she said, gesturing toward the cars in the driveway. Your aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone wanted to understand what happened yesterday, and the conversations have been difficult. Difficult how? She struggled with the words, clearly trying to find a way to explain family dynamics that had been turned upside down. Some people are proud, some people are hurt, some people are angry, and some people are questioning whether they ever really knew you at all. The summary hit harder than I had expected. I'd spent so much time thinking about my immediate family's reaction that I hadn't considered how the extended family would process the revelations. The cousins who'd teased me about my boring military job, the aunts and uncles who'd offered career advice based on their assumption that I was wasting my potential, the family friends who'd expressed sympathy for my parents having a daughter who couldn't seem to find her way in life. Mom, I said carefully, I know this is hard to understand, but everything I did was to protect this family and to serve my country. I never meant for the secrecy to hurt anyone. But it did hurt us, she replied, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Sarah, your Aunt Linda has been telling people for years that she felt sorry for us because our daughter couldn't figure out how to have a real career. Your cousin Mike has been offering to help you find a more suitable job every time he sees you. We've been defending choices we didn't understand, making excuses for what we thought was your lack of direction. The revelation that my family had been enduring years of judgment and sympathy from relatives who thought they were being supportive was devastating. I'd been so focused on protecting the classified nature of my work that I'd never considered the social cost to my parents of having a daughter whose life appeared to be going nowhere. Mom, I said carefully, I know this is hard to understand, but everything I did was to protect this family and to serve my country. I never meant for the secrecy to hurt anyone. But it did hurt us, she replied, her voice growing stronger. Sarah, your Aunt Linda has been telling people for years that she felt sorry for us because our daughter couldn't figure out how to have a real career. Your cousin Mike has been offering to help you find a more suitable job every time he sees you. We've been defending choices we didn't understand, making excuses for what we thought was your lack of direction. The revelation that my family had been enduring years of judgment and sympathy from relatives who thought they were being supportive was devastating.
I'd been so focused on protecting the classified nature of my work that I'd never considered the social cost to my parents of having a daughter whose life appeared to be going nowhere. "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it with every fiber of my being. "I never wanted you to have to defend me against family criticism." "That's not the point," my mother said, her voice growing stronger. "The point is that we were willing to defend you because we love you, but we were defending someone who didn't exist. We were making excuses for choices that weren't real. We were worrying about a daughter who was actually more successful than any of us had ever imagined." Before I could respond, the front door opened and my father appeared, still wearing his police uniform but looking more vulnerable than I had ever seen him before. "Sarah," he said, embracing me with the kind of desperate hug that suggested he'd been afraid he might never see me again. "Thank God you're safe." "Dad, I'm fine. The mission was successful. We prevented the attack." He held me at arm's length, studying my face with the intensity of someone trying to memorize important details. "The mission, Jesus, Sarah. My daughter was coordinating international counterterrorism operations while I was arresting her for espionage." The irony in his voice carried a weight of regret that made my chest tight. "Dad, you are protecting your community based on the information you had. That's exactly what a good police officer should do." "But I should have known," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I should have trusted that the daughter I raised would never betray her country or her family. I should have known that if you were keeping secrets, there had to be a good reason." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of voices from inside the house, multiple family members discussing something with the kind of intensity that suggested disagreement. My father's expression darkened. "How bad is it in there?" I asked. "Mixed reactions," he admitted. "Your brother James is struggling with feeling like he doesn't know his own sister. Your Aunt Linda is embarrassed about years of criticism that turns out to have been completely wrong. Uncle Robert keeps asking why you couldn't trust the family with the truth. And David," he paused, and I felt my heart rate increase. "What about David?" "He's trying to explain to everyone that he knew who you really were when he married you. But that's making some people feel even more excluded, like you trusted your fiancé, but not your own family." The complexity of family emotions that I'd unleashed was staggering. Every relationship had been affected by the revelation, and each person was processing the information through their own lens of hurt feelings, misunderstandings, and assumptions that had been proven wrong. "Mom," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Okay." "When you decided not to tell us about your real career, was it only because of military security requirements, or was it also because you didn't trust us enough to believe we could handle the truth?" The question cut straight to the heart of the issue that would determine whether our family relationships could be rebuilt or would remain forever damaged. Because while security clearance requirements had certainly prevented me from sharing many details, the emotional distance that had grown between us over the years had deeper roots than government protocols.
"Mom," I said slowly, "it was both. The security requirements were real. I legally couldn't share most details about my work. But it was also easier to let you believe I was unsuccessful than to risk disappointing you with partial truths that couldn't capture the full picture of what I was doing." The honesty hung in the air between us like a bridge that might support the weight of rebuilding our relationship or might collapse under the strain of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding. "Well," my father said after a long moment, "I guess the only way to find out if this family can handle the truth is to go inside and start telling it." As we walked toward the front door, I realized that the next few hours would determine whether the sacrifices I'd made for my career had been worth the cost to my family relationships. The mission in Eastern Europe had been successful, but the mission of rebuilding trust with the people I loved most was just beginning. And unlike counterterrorism operations, there was no training manual for this kind of challenge. Walking into my childhood living room felt like entering a courtroom where I was simultaneously the defendant, the evidence, and the jury. 12 family members sat in a rough circle, their faces displaying every emotion from pride to confusion to barely contained anger. The coffee table was covered with newspapers, Apparently, my arrest and subsequent vindication had made regional headlines, and several laptops showed paused news videos about the prevented terrorist attack in Poland. David stood immediately when I entered, crossing the room to embrace me with relief that felt desperate. "How are you holding up?" he whispered against my ear. "Still figuring that out," I whispered back, acutely aware that our reunion was being watched by family members who were still processing the fact that my husband had known my real identity when they hadn't. "Sarah," Aunt Linda said, her voice carrying the sharp edge that had made me dread family gatherings as a child, "I think we all deserve some explanations." The room fell silent, and I found myself in the surreal position of briefing my own family like they were a hostile congressional committee. But as I looked around at faces I'd known my entire life, people who had celebrated my birthdays, attended my high school graduation, worried about my future, I realized that their anger came from love, even when it felt like an attack. "You're right," I said, settling into the armchair that had been my designated spot during family meetings since childhood. "You all deserve explanations, and you deserve the truth. But I need you to understand that some of what I'm going to tell you was classified until 18 hours ago, and some of it is still classified now." Uncle Robert, my father's brother and a Vietnam veteran, leaned forward with the intensity of someone who understood military service but not military secrecy. "Sarah, I've held security clearances. I understand classified work. What I don't understand is lying to your family for 10 years about who you are." The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be painful. "Uncle Robert, you're right that I made choices about what to share and what to keep private, but I need you to understand the scope of what I've been doing." I took a deep breath and began telling my family the story they'd never heard, the real version of the past decade of my life. I told them about the intelligence training that had identified me as someone with exceptional analytical abilities. I told them about the first assignment that had led to preventing a bombing in Germany. I told them about the promotions that had come with increasing responsibility for operations that saved lives but couldn't be acknowledged publicly. "The logistics coordination I mentioned at Christmas dinner last year?" I said, looking at my cousin Mike, who had offered to help me find a more stable job. "I was coordinating the interdiction of weapons shipments that were destined for 3 different terrorist organizations. The successful operation prevented attacks that could have killed hundreds of people." Mike's face cycled through expressions of disbelief, embarrassment, and something that might have been awe. "You're telling me that when I offered to get you an interview at my accounting firm, you were already running international counterterrorism operations?" "Yes." The simple word carried the weight of every misunderstanding, every moment of family disappointment, every assumption about my life that had been fundamentally wrong. As I continued sharing details that had been declassified for this conversation, I watched my family's perception of me undergo a complete transformation. But it was my brother James who asked the question that cut to the heart of our family's crisis. "Sarah, I understand why you couldn't share classified details. What I don't understand is why you let us think you were failing at life when you were actually more successful than any of us." The question forced me to confront the emotional choices I'd made beyond the legal requirements of my security clearance. "James, it started with legitimate security restrictions, but it became something more complicated than that. It was easier to let you all worry about my lack of direction than to give you partial truths that would make you worry about my safety." "But we worried anyway," my mother said quietly. "We worried constantly about your future, your finances, your happiness. The only difference is that we were worrying about problems that didn't exist while being completely unaware of the real dangers you were facing." The observation hit with devastating accuracy. My attempts to protect my family from worry actually caused them a different kind of worry. The fear that my daughter was wasting her life and would struggle forever to find her place in the world. "There's something else," I said, knowing that complete honesty was the only path forward. Part of me was afraid that if you knew what I really did,
You'd worry so much about my safety that you'd ask me to choose between my career and my family, and I wasn't ready to make that choice. The admission hung in the air like a confession that changed everything, because it revealed that my secrecy hadn't just been about protecting classified information. It had been about protecting my right to choose a dangerous career that my family might not have supported if they'd understood its true nature. "You thought we'd ask you to quit?" my father asked, his voice carrying hurt that was deeper than anger. "Dad, you spent my entire childhood telling me that the military wasn't a place for someone with my sensitivities. You thought it'd wash out of basic training. What was I supposed to think you'd say if you knew I was coordinating operations where people's lives depended on my decisions?" The question forced him to confront his own assumptions and biases, and I could see the realization dawning that his lack of confidence in my abilities had contributed to my reluctance to share my successes. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I was wrong about your capabilities, wrong about what you could handle, and wrong about what the military could offer someone like you. But Sarah, being wrong doesn't mean I wouldn't have been proud of you if I'd known the truth." David, who had been listening to this family conversation with the perspective of someone who knew both versions of me, finally spoke up. "If I may," he said diplomatically, "I think everyone in this room made assumptions that turned out to be incorrect. Sarah assumed you couldn't handle knowing about her real work. You assumed she wasn't capable of significant military success. But the truth is that she's both the daughter you raised and the colonel who prevents terrorist attacks." The observation reframed the entire conflict in terms that everyone could understand. I wasn't two different people. I was one person whose family had only been allowed to see part of who I was. "So what happens now?" Aunt Linda asked, her tone softer than it had been at the beginning of the conversation. "How do we move forward from here?" It was the question I'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure, because moving forward would require changes from everyone, not just me being more honest about my work, but my family accepting that the daughter and sister they thought they knew had actually been more capable and more accomplished than they ever imagined. "Now," I said, "we figure out how to be a family that knows the truth about each other. I can't share every detail of my work. Some things will always be classified, but I can share more than I have been, and I can trust you to handle information about my career and my life." "And we," my father said, standing up with the kind of formal bearing that indicated he was about to make an official statement, "need to apologize for 10 years of treating our daughter like she was disappointing us when she was actually serving her country with distinction." What followed was unlike any family gathering I'd ever experienced. One by one, relatives who had criticized my choices or expressed concern about my future offered apologies that were awkward and genuine. Aunt Linda apologized for years of comments about my lack of direction. Uncle Robert apologized for questioning my commitment to serving my country. Cousin Mike apologized for assuming I needed career guidance from someone less successful than I actually was. But it was my mother's words that affected me most deeply. "Sarah, I'm sorry we created a family where you felt like you had to choose between honesty and acceptance. I'm sorry you thought we couldn't handle being proud of you for who you really are." As the afternoon wore on, the conversation shifted from apologies to curiosity. Family members asked questions about my work that I could finally answer, shared stories about worrying about me that now seemed unnecessary, and began the process of getting to know the person I'd actually been all along. The most powerful moment came when my nephew Tommy, James's 8-year-old son, asked the question that cut through all the adult complexity. "Aunt Sarah, does this mean you're like a superhero who saves people?" The innocent question made everyone laugh, breaking the tension that had dominated the day. "Something like that, Tommy," I said, pulling him onto my lap. "I help catch bad guys and keep people safe." "That's so cool," he said with the uncomplicated admiration that only children can offer. "I want to be like you when I grow up." As the sun set through the living room windows, casting long shadows across the familiar furniture of my childhood,
I realized that the family gathering that had started as a crisis was ending as something much more valuable, a new beginning based on truth instead of assumptions. My father stood up as the evening wound down, raising his coffee cup in an impromptu toast. To my daughter Sarah, Colonel Thompson, who has been serving her country and protecting innocent people while we thought she was struggling to find her way. We're proud of who you are. We're proud of what you've accomplished, and we're proud to be your family. To Colonel Sarah, the room echoed, and for the first time in 10 years, I felt like I could be both versions of myself in the same place at the same time.
Later that evening, as David and I sat on the front porch swing where I'd spent countless childhood hours, I reflected on the past 48 hours that had changed everything about my life. The false arrest that had threatened to destroy my career had actually saved my family relationships by forcing the truth into the open. Do you think they'll be able to handle it? David asked, taking my hand as we watched the quiet street where I'd grown up. Knowing what you really do for a living? I think they're stronger than I gave them credit for, I said. And I think I'm going to find out that being honest with the people you love is less dangerous than protecting them from the truth. As we sat together in the peaceful evening air, I realized that the most important mission of my career hadn't been preventing a terrorist attack in Poland. It had been learning to trust my family with the truth about who I really was. For the first time in a decade, I was home in every sense of the word. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.